So we're going to dig into a really important part of social science research, and that is thinking through conceptualization and what concepts mean. Concepts are sort of the building blocks of social science research. They're sort of our definitions so that we can have, transparency and replicability and all those things that I want. And really, you can't even begin a process of data collection or a research project until you've kind of sat down and had a conversation with yourself about what concepts actually mean. And so if I was interested in studying, how quality of life affects development within a community, there are some really complex ideas in just that research question that kind of need to be unpacked, right? So what do I mean when I say quality of life? Do I mean that people are happy? Do I mean that people want to stay in a location? Do I mean that people want to come to a location? Like, what does quality of life actually mean and what goes into that? Likewise, I need to figure out what a community means. Am I talking a city? Am I talking a neighborhood? Am I talking a block, right? I have to wrestle with that if I'm going to be able to tackle that question. I need to be able to communicate that to other people so that they know what I mean when I say a community, because it's kind of a mushy term. And then lastly, economic development. Are we thinking about jobs? Are we thinking about tax revenue? Are we thinking about wages going up? So what do we mean when we talk about economic development? And until we have definitions for those terms, until we have ways to measure them, we really can't move forward with the research project. And so we could talk about this in terms of conceptualization, which is sort of the bigger picture philosophy. What do things mean? Or we could think about this in terms of operationalization. So the mechanics of how I'm going to go about measuring that particular thing. And we'll talk about conceptualization from both an inductive approach today, right now, and then a deductive approach, which we'll do a little bit later on. And then we'll shift gears and talk later on about the operationalization piece. But I think it's worth talking briefly about some of the ways that people can think about doing this. And so the easiest and most straightforward way of doing conceptualization is to not reinvent the wheel, is to go and look at what other people have done. And if they figured out a way to do things, maybe you should just do what they're doing. And there are some advantages to that. So I always use the example of gross domestic product or GDP. For most of human history, there wasn't really a way to measure the size of an economy. And then John Maynard Keynes in the 1940s came up with a way of defining and measuring this idea of gross domestic product, the sum total of what an economy was cranking out in a given year. And so it became the standard way in which economists talked about the size of an economy. Governments began measuring GDP every year. And so this data exists, and you can go out there and you can study it and you can get it. And it's really handy. And it's great because everyone pretty much knows what you mean when you say GDP. And so oftentimes the easiest route is just to piggyback on what other people have done. But it's worth pointing out that just because other people have done something and just because it's widely used doesn't mean it's actually appropriate for what you're interested in. And so I would, I'll highlight some known problems with GDP and then highlight why we might think, why we might want to be hyper aware of that. So if I'm thinking about GDP, I'm thinking about things that are captured as economic transactions in the formal economy. What is not being picked up by GDP is the black market economy. And so if your economy is largely based around the sale of drugs and that's all off the books, your GDP is going to miss that completely. And there's not really going to be a story to tell about GDP because that's not captured there. That also creates sort of weird scenarios where if I mow my lawn, there's no GDP created because there's no economic transaction. There's just me taking time out of my weekend to mow my lawn. But if I hire a lawn mowing company to mow my lawn, I'm creating GDP because I'm paying them for a service, mowing the lawn. It's the exact same service I performed on my own, but this time it's creating GDP. If I press my child into service, right, I don't pay my child, or if I do, I pay my child sort of in an allowance, that doesn't count as GDP. If I pay the neighborhood child to mow my lawn, probably won't be counted as GDP unless that child reports that income on a tax form, at which point it shows up as money that's paid for a service and counts as GDP. So it's actually not the act, it's not the production of a nicely mowed lawn that's creating GDP, it's how it's being reported and whether or not that sort of checks the box for John Maynard Keynes's formula. Now, that has implications, because if we're thinking about things like the effect of YouTube on GDP, right? I might think that YouTube is a highly successful business. It's cranking out lots of ads and lots of people view it, and that there should be more GDP because we now have this service of videos that are widely available. But YouTube also has lots of do-it-yourself videos. And before, where I used to, take my car into the shop every time a taillight went out, now I just look up on, YouTube, 1994 Ford Ranger, how to change a taillight, and somebody's got a video on that, and I can watch it, and I can go and change my own taillight. And so before, while I was generating GDP, now I'm not. And recognizing that that something can change behavior in a way that, even though it's generating ad revenue and generating revenue, is actually altering GDP in this other way, is something that I think is worth paying attention to and thinking about, like, how would that relationship actually work? And that relationship ends up being deeply intertwined with the measure that we're using to measure economic growth and economic activity. And maybe that's not appropriate. Maybe we need to come up with a different measure that takes into account that people sometimes do things for themselves, that people are performing economic activities like changing taillights on 1994 Ford Rangers without that showing up on the books. Okay, so that's a big, long digression about GDP, but if you are using somebody else's measure, it's absolutely essential that you understand that measure in the ways that it may or may not be appropriate for the thing that you're doing. Okay, so that assumes that somebody else has done this. That assumes that somebody else is there's an established way of doing it. If there's not, you may have to create that established way of doing it. And so there's lots of strategies. I'd like to kind of talk through an inductive approach using grounded theory. And so we talked a little bit about grounded theory before when we talked about working with qualitative data. I think I even gave the same example of my wife bringing back field notes from Ethiopia on 30 plus different orphanages. And so the idea of grounded theory is that you're going to let the definition emerge from the data, that you have a big pile of lots of information, and somewhere in that information, not like in a nice, neat, tidy way, but somewhere collectively in that information is everything that you need to build that definition. And so you're going to read through your notes or through your memos or through the raw data a couple times, just to kind of get a sense of how terms are being used, what definitions seem to be in play. And as you read through, you might start noting themes and patterns. So at one point, I was reading through these notes on orphanages, and I know that some orphanages were described as like a home, and other orphanages were described as like an institution. Like that seemed to be a pretty stark difference in how these organizations were set up. And once I started paying attention to that sort of difference, I began looking for, well, what is it about this orphanage that makes me think it's set up like a home versus this one that's set up as an institution? And so it might be that the children are grouped into small, stable units, right? This is your cohort. This is your family unit, right? And that would make it a home environment versus an more industrial, institutional setting. It might have all the kids sort of lumped together, or it might organize them by age group, but not sort of this sort of coherent, this is your cohort, this is your family group, but instead some other sort of process that's more bureaucratic, right? So I could look at the grouping. I could look at the way that children address the adults. So is it aunt or uncle, right, which might indicate a family, or is it sir or ma'am or father or sister? A couple of the orphanages were Catholic. And that would maybe give me a sense of, is it family or is it formal and institutional? I could look at maybe the structure, right? Is there artwork on the walls the kids did versus are the walls painted, sanitarium green? And again, so I found different things in those notes that would allow me to say, if it has these sorts of things, if it looks this way, if this is being referenced, it's a home style orphanage. If it has, these things, these are good indicators and prompts that it's an institutional orphanage. And so you read through and you sort of identify these pieces and you sort of build them together until you have a working definition. And you repeat processing through that data time after time after time until you stop adding to your definitions. And so you stop getting new stuff out of that data, new insights, and it just becomes sort of, all the relevant information has been extracted. So that's one way of doing conceptualization. But again, it's an inductive process in which I'm starting with a big pile of data, and I'm trying to use that big pile of data to kind of build up an idea in my head. We'll talk in a little bit about deductive concept development, where I'm starting with what's in my head, right? I'm going to sit down in my armchair and I'm going to lean back and I'm going to think about the world and how I understand it and how it should fit together. And that's going to be the process by which I'm building my definition. And there's not necessarily a right way or a wrong way. Some strategies depend on how well a topic is understood, how well theory is developed around it, and whether or not we have data available that we could use to build those definitions the way that I was able to with those field notes on orphanages. Because my wife had done all that work to assemble those notes, we were able to have that conversation about definitions.